Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor of our podcast, The Great Courses Plus. This is the teaching company's The Great Courses, which I've been listening to for decades. They have thousands of professionally produced college courses or courses taught by college professors, the best in the country. And they've introduced a app for your phone. It's thegreatcoursesplus.com. And so you just touch the app and you open up the course you want to listen to. The one I just started this week is on Understanding the Old Testament by Professor Robert D. Miller II. So just to give you an idea of how it works, you just touch on the lecture you want to listen to. Like number 1 is the Old Testament as literature. Number 2 is the Genesis creation story. I'm right now on lecture 3, What God Intended for Adam and Eve. Oh boy, this should be interesting. In any case, this is great because you can skip around. If I find one of the lectures boring, I just skip to the next one. You can do it on audio or video and all from your phone. It's a terrific way to consume content, particularly during social isolation. During the pandemic, it's a great way to become an autodidact. So if you want to know more, you can, if you sign up through my podcast, then you get a free trial. So go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and you get a free trial with free access to the entire library of all these hundreds and hundreds of courses and thousands of lectures. So with that, I'll introduce my next guest. My guest this week is Mona Sue Weissmark, and to discuss her new book, The Science of Diversity. Mona is an American clinical psychologist and social psychologist, researcher, and author whose work on diversity and justice has received global recognition. She's best known for her groundbreaking social experiment of bringing children of Holocaust survivors face to face with children of Nazis, and later grandchildren and great-grandchildren of African-American slaves with descendants of slave owners. She's also a professor of psychology and author of numerous journal articles and books, including Doing Psychotherapy Effectively, Justice Matters, Legacy of the Holocaust in World War II, and the new book that we're discussing from Oxford University Press, The Science of Diversity. This was a most interesting conversation because we're recording this right in the middle of 2020, and so I wanted to talk to her about Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, reparations, the response to COVID-19 and income inequality and the sense of injustices that a lot of people feel going on in society now. And this is what she does. So we got into some really interesting discussions about all of that, plus the nature of the self and free will and what is justice and, how to bring about restorative justice across multi-generations. And because this conversation we're having now on reparations, for example, and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think this is not going to just fade away when things return to relative normalcy in society. I think this is going to continue. So I wanted to get her opinions on all these, and she gave them to me very thoughtfully. So with that, I give you Mona Sue Weissmark. Mona, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So the new book, as we can see over your right shoulder, is The Science of Diversity. Okay, I read it, all but maybe the last 10 pages. I didn't quite get to that. And I have to say, this was, it was really kind of a mind blower. I think it's a super important book for a couple of reasons, but in part, if we had to retitle your book, I'd almost call it, if this wasn't already taken, How to Be an Anti-Racist or Anti-Misogynist or Anti-Bigot or whatever. Because the science of diversity shows you that we really can't stereotype and prejudge people based on these collective categories we put people in, which is all good. But the problem is that you're a scientist, and your program here is, in a way, I think, challenged, if not undermined, the scientific enterprise in which we want to find collective laws that explain whole actions of human action based on generalization. So we might say something like the number one predictor of violence is maleness or something like that. And what you've showed is that it really comes down to so many individual differences that it's really, really hard to determine causality in human action. So I thought, in this conversation, I want to start there, the science of how we understand human action, and then move in the direction toward understanding the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the movement of nationalism and, ethno-nationalism and all that populism we're going through since 2016, because and now, reparations are back on the table as a conversation. These are hugely important issues that are on the table for 2020 and probably in the next several years. And you're a scientist addressing these, what are really policy issues. So I think, everyone in Congress should read your book before they vote on these kinds of things, because the science behind it really matters. So let's start there. What got you into studying the science of diversity?
Well, you said so many things right before that question, but we're going to get into that. So I'll just focus. Would you like me to
pick up anywhere? That's fine.
Focus at the moment,
whatever you feel like.
Well, I'll answer two questions. One, you brought up the difference between applying scientific thinking to what I would call deterministic systems, where you can predict and use statistics to make predictions, which of course you can in many cases. It's how the insurance business stays in business. I look very much at dynamic system and interactions. So it's people studying people, and then unpredictable things happen in those situations. So therefore, I'm not so as interested in predicting as I am in looking at topics that people bring to the table that are polarizing, and how can we study that? What led me to that was your question. What led me to that, or what the motivation was?
I know about your background. Your background is really interesting as a child survivor or survivors of the Holocaust, and that led you into trying to understand what it's like to be a Nazi and what it's like to be a victim of a Nazi, and the psychology of that. I mean, that's really hugely interesting and important, and drove so much of psychological research in the 60s and 70s. And so I think, as far as I could tell, that kind of moved you personally into understanding human behavior.
And that actually brings me, that ties into what we just mentioned, the unpredictability, right? So I kind of distinguish between science with an upper S as a noun and scientific thinking. And I know you talk a lot about that too, Michael, in your lectures. And so when you're using scientific thinking, you're also beginning with a guess. Why is that hypothesis? How did I get to that hypothesis? So absolutely, yeah, my personal ground is what led me with some research looking at children of survivors, for example, and children of descendants of slaves, and how that impacted them. And a few studies on descendants of Nazis and a few on descendants of slave owners. No one had actually thought about, well, what will happen if you bring the two groups together, and what happens dynamically in those conversations? How does the past impact them? How was that injustice transmitted? That brings us to Black Lives Matter, to reparations, to everything we're seeing today. So I was motivated to look at that because in my own personal history, I went through that process. I mean, I might add, I had the least traumatic childhood I know of. My parents were very devoted. That's actually important to mention. Grew up on a farm in Vineland, New Jersey. My first friends was a dog and a chicken. And my only memory of the past was seeing the numbers on my parents' arm, right? And then later on, I would inquire about that. And so then I began to be curious, what if an injustice cannot be balanced in the first generation, right? Then what happens? How does that play out? Psychologically, I'm not talking legally or economically. So that's what led me to look at the psychology of injustice and the diversity of science.
Yeah. Our listeners can find your videos of you getting these survivors together in the same room. It's really an incredible thing to witness. And I think if we just start there with the survivors of the children of Nazis and the children of Holocaust survivors, and I think the relevance to the reparations question is that most of us who are neither victims or perpetrators or nth generations thereof feel like, what has this got to do with me? Why do I have to pay for, past generation sins? And, we shouldn't, hold the children of the perpetrators accountable. And so I don't get it. What's the issue here? So talk for a moment about why let's say, child of a Nazi guard at a concentration camp would feel any guilt. He didn't do anything. He wasn't even born yet. Or the child of one of the surviving victims, why would they feel whatever it is they feel since it didn't happen to them? And I think the generalization is here for most of us who in America think like, well, I wasn't a slaveholder. I wasn't even a descendant of a slaveholder. I came here last week, or my parents came here, 20 years ago or whatever. What has this got to do with me? And for the children of former slaves, they're nth generation away now. Why should they get a check every month for this when it didn't happen to them? So so take it from there. What is the psychology or the neuroscience behind the carrying on of these kinds of atrocities past many generations?
Well, I think you summed up the feelings really well on both sides. So I think descendants of victims, and whether it's descendants of Holocaust survivors or descendants of slave owners, it's natural to feel, psychologically speaking, not everybody. I think that's really important to mention. I don't mean to be lumping all descendants. There's a lot of variety within the groups, but a lot of descendants of victims. And I think it's important to say here, victims, these are not victims and victimizers. These are the descendants of. There's a need for justice, that the sense that something was done to their ancestors and that no one has paid for it. And again, I mean psychologically. And so wanting some kind of closure, wanting to hold someone responsible. What we found when we brought the two groups together, both slave owners and descendants of slaves, and not descendants of Nazis and descendants of survivors, that, well, the other side, as you so aptly pointed out, not everyone on the other side feels responsible for what their parents or great-great-grandparents did. In fact, at one of our meetings, a descendant of a slave owner said, I'm not sure you could say this today. Someone in class the other night asked me if we did this meeting today, what would be different? And what would be different is, I think, with the cancel culture, it would be harder for people to be honest and truthful. But this was, some years ago, and the descendant of a slave owner said, slavery was legal then. That's a good example of someone, he didn't mean it in a mean way. He was not an extremist. He just said it was legal and I don't feel guilty for it. On the other hand, was a descendant of a slave owner whose parents are very active right now in Ohio in the KKK. And she did feel very guilty, very responsible. So there's a variety. But on the flip side, what happens is the descendants of victims, because they have this need to see justice psychologically, this sense of balance, someone pay, it's very difficult for them to hear the other side. Like when you said, when you explained that many people in our country, whites, do not feel that they are responsible for what happened. That's very hard for someone on the descendant of a slave to hear. And I know that, personally and professionally. When I went through my process, you want all the Germans to feel responsible for what their forefathers did. Very fascinating, and that is the science of diversity. What I talk about when we bring these groups together to study them is, and this just happened in class last night, so if you can have a conversation on these polarizing topics, and you can, this is very difficult to do, but if you can step out and say, wow, okay, this descendant of a slave owner has said slavery was legal and he does not feel responsible. Or this descendant of a Nazi just said, you know what, I've suffered because I have been made to feel responsible for something that I never did.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in fact, we did a statistical analysis. We used lag sequential analysis to look at the conversational patterns. And what we found, this is not really that surprising, but we actually studied it, is that each side, again, these are descendants, felt in some sense like victims. The so-called descendants of the victimizers felt that they have also been suffering at some level because they're held responsible for something that they don't feel that they did. I don't know if that answers your question.
The conversations that are on that video, people can watch if they go to your webpage that you reprint in the book, some of the comments. I'll just read a few just to give people an idea of what goes through people's heads, call it rationalization or whatever. Steve Pinker calls it the moralization gap, which he got from Roy Baumeister's book called Evil, in which Roy interviewed these serial killers in prison. And to a man, and they're pretty much all men, you know, they gave what they thought were perfectly good reasons for why they did what they did. You know, he had it coming, he insulted me in front of my girlfriend, or he you know, or she cheated on me, so I killed her, or whatever. You know, they had what in their heads were, you know, this is why I did it. I'm not an evil person. This was an act that, you know, had to be done for moral reasons. In other words, there's kind of a moralization behind these crimes.
But those are the actual victims and victimizers you're talking about.
I'm talking about
not the descendant.
That's right. The actual. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, I want to pause there because that's very, very different. And so I can see where you would use like a rationalization or moralization. But these are, I'm talking about descendants who had no part in any act. And so I would not use the word moralization or justification. Not at all, because they did not commit an act. That's what makes the topic polarizing.
Okay. Right.
Because they each have, even though people will, even though it's hard, right? I mean, I would say personally that my mother suffered more than anyone, right? She lost all her family and my father. And when a descendant, not a Nazi, a descendant of a Nazi said to me, but you know what, we suffered too. Our cities were bombed. My parents were forced. From my viewpoint, I've suffered more. My parents suffered more, but from their viewpoint, that's why I would not call it moralization or justification. Their view is they suffered too. And I cannot deny their viewpoint if I want to have a conversation. If I want to impose on them my view that I suffered more, we're probably not going to get very far in the conversation. That's what the science of diversity method tries to do. Tries to look at these polarizing topics without without in advance judging the other person's viewpoint.
That's sort of
But I want to emphasize that's not true for the first generation. Obviously, if you've committed a crime, you've committed a crime. I'm talking about descendants, and that's so important.
Although I do want to talk about the actual victims and restitution. I mean, I saw this yesterday there was a news story about the settlement of Harvey Weinstein. I think it was like $20 million or $40 million or something. I guess his insurance companies are going to pay out to these women. But several of them were on the news last night saying it's not the money and it isn't going to restore the damage done to me. It helps. But, you know, I need something more. You know, so that there is still that kind of gap there between, and of course, Harvey's sitting there going, what did I do wrong? You know, so just a couple passages. A couple passages from your book.
I mean, that's complicated. I mean, I agree. I don't study that at all. Between the victim and victimizers, I don't study that. So I don't know anything about that really.
But just back to your book here. Here's a couple of passages that I thought were quite striking. Another child of a Nazi described it like this. I think the Americans and the Allies went too far. I think of the bombing of German cities like Dresden was unfair. And I don't think it was right that the Allies tried the Nazis. It should have been done by German courts. And the other thing is, not all Germans were Nazis. The first people killed in Dachau were German people, not Jewish people. I think the Jews want to make it seem like they were the only victims, but they're not. The German people suffered too, and people need to know it. But Germans are afraid to talk about it. Yeah. Well, everything that guy said is true. I mean, we did bomb Dresden and Hamburg, and there were moral debates about whether we should commit mass bombing. At the beginning of the war, when the Germans did it to the British in the Blitz, the feeling was like, that's an immoral act. That's like chemical warfare. We just don't do that. That's out of bounds. And, within 2 years, we were doing it. So he's right in that sense. I don't know how you counter that other than what you just said. You don't counter it. You just acknowledge, yes, that's true. And then, because you don't want to get into, I guess, a victimhood Olympics or something like who had the most suffering.
And that's actually the really key point, Michael, because it's very, very difficult. So when people say, oh, just be rational, and have a rational discussion about this. So I would say that's not always possible because there are strong feelings on this, right? So why can't you acknowledge the other side, right? What makes it difficult to hear a German say that? Well, the other side feels like their family suffered so much, and that is disrespectful. You see that today with descendants of slaves. If a descendant of slave owner says it's legal, I suffer too, we lost a lot of economic, we lost a lot during the Civil War, what have you. It's very hard for the other side to hear that. And it's not easy. So the thing is, using the science of diversity method in these conversations, which I think we're not used to. Our educational system doesn't train us to do this. I mean, I know you know this, but we don't have these conversations on who's right, on who's wrong. That's not the purpose of the conversation. The purpose of the conversation is to keep it moving and to see if you can understand your own strong feelings about it and not necessarily change your mind, but hear the other side. And that is not easy.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
If I recall, it took several long days of conversations for you to make much progress on that front.
Correct. But I mean, even this is happening in my classes. I've been teaching this for 20 years. Just had a class last night, and it was very fascinating. The students had to do, they're doing a project, measuring identity, people's ethnic identity. And so we had them in breakout groups, and there happened to be an African-American student talking to a white student, and they were talking about their identities, giving each other the measure. And she had an insight in it where she felt very much like, I've suffered because I have a history of slavery. I don't even know my background very well, where my African roots are, but I'm proud of it because I know they survived. And she was very surprised in this meeting to discover that this white person was ashamed of being white. Never occurred to her. And then she began to wonder, did anything in her behavior impact the person to feel that way? So there's a recognition in this process of the other person's views and how they might contribute to it. So I'll give you one other example. There was in the descendant of Nazi survivor, there was a descendant of a high-ranking Nazi whose father was responsible for the murders of many, many Jews. And then she said that she grew up really guilty, felt terrible and afraid. And it was the first time descendants of survivors thought, wow, I didn't realize she was suffering. And they kind of reached out about that. But that's a process.
Right. That's part of that restorative justice movement that's underway now. I wrote about this in The Moral Arc that that somebody who just burgles your house, they don't want to hurt you. They just want your stuff because whatever their motive is. But of course, for the victim, this is incredibly disruptive. I mean, it just like ruins their lives for months or years. And, they can't sleep at night and they're anxious and so on. And to the burglar, it's like, this was nothing. So, I read a few accounts of these where, they would get them in the same room together And usually the burglar said, "Gee, I had no idea it was so disruptive. I just wanted I just wanted your TV set or whatever." And that kind of acknowledgement of, I really ruined your life, made the victim feel better.
But what I am suggesting, Michael, is that in the next generation down, if you want to have a conversation, again, these are not people who did anything to each other. They're innocent. They're both innocent. Right. And if you begin with a restorative justice in mind, that the other side has to apologize or make amends or give you reparations, that will end the conversation. That will not restore justice because you're actually imposing a model on it. And these are descendants, and both sides have not perpetuated any kind of crime on the other. So to really have this dynamic conversation, you cannot begin with expecting an acknowledgement or an apology.
Right.
Because that will end the conversation because many of the other descendants don't feel they have to apologize or acknowledge. So that makes it more difficult in a sense.
What do you think about these truth and reconciliation movements in different nations where the nation apologizes, like Australia apologized to the indigenous peoples and Canada apologized to the First Peoples and those sorts of things? Is that at least a good start?
Yeah, I think that my opinion is not really so important because, what their reasons are, whether they were political reasons or whether they had other reasons, I don't know. My take on it would be psychologically in groups. I can't really comment on that. I'm familiar with that because when we started these meetings in the 90s, people kind of took some of the research I was doing and said, "Oh, now we need to ask." We can do this at the nationwide, but the goal is different. So if we're just trying to study this and understand this and apply the science of diversity method, you can't, I would say you're imposing a model and expecting people to apologize, paradoxically, may create a bigger problem. And that's what we're seeing in the United States today. There are many people who resent having to apologize. And I'm not saying personally whether I agree or disagree. I'm just saying those opinions are out there, whether we like it or not. In fact, recent Pew data showed that, for example, support of Black Lives Matter, if you look at blacks and whites, 71% of blacks strongly support it. And it was 31% of whites support it. Big gap. Between Democrats and Republicans, 62% of Democrats, 7% of Republicans. This isn't surprising. There's a huge polarization. But if we're coming forth and saying, "Oh, you have to apologize for slavery," and no matter how convinced I personally may be of that, or you or anyone else, the fact is there's going to be a whole other group of people who have a completely different view. Right. So if our goal is to move forward in a conversation, we have to consider that our view is not acceptable to other people.
Right. Well, okay. So where do you go from there? I mean, here last Sunday's New York Times Magazine cover story is, the case for reparations. That wasn't the title. I think it was What We Are Owed.
Right.
And her case was not moral so much as economic, and it sort of forces those of us that don't think about these things, that is us, sort of middle-aged, middle-class white guys that, haven't been affected by this directly or even indirectly. Wow, I really hadn't thought about the trajectory of economic inequality over the last century and a half, and how that results in different school systems and educational outcomes, and therefore different incomes and wealth disparities and that sort of thing. So there, she seems to be taking not a moral case or even a psychological one, but just more of a kind of an economic calculation.
And again, I don't address economic or political. I'm not an expert in political or economic, but I can tell you pretty confidently that there will be a lot of people who will resent any kind of economic reparations. And furthermore, there'll be a lot of other groups of people who say, wait a second, who've had advantages, I've been left behind. So, though that person may feel strongly about the economic impact of slavery and how that's affecting income inequality today, there are many people who disagree.
Right. Okay.
And,
So how do we
so,
get past that impasse then? Because that's probably not going to change anytime soon.
no, correct. Well, one way to get past the impasse is to the notion that you can impose and control and demand what other people should be thinking, accepting from a psychological viewpoint. There's the notion that, yeah, it's nice to feel right, but it's entirely possible that what you're thinking and feeling is wrong from the other viewpoint. You have to consider the other viewpoint. But furthermore, practically, pragmatically, if you impose something, it may have a backlash. And though you're trying to solve one problem, the solution to the problem is actually creating a bigger problem, which is resentment and anger about what's being imposed on. So first you have to begin using this kind of scientific thinking, not science with an upper S, scientific thinking, to look at both these viewpoints and to consider both these viewpoints and give them their equal due. That's the only fair-sided method we actually have. Not talking again legally.
Yeah.
That's a whole other issue politically. Yeah. But as far as I know, the wonderful thing about scientific thinking, it's our only universal method, globally accepted, for advancing our way of learning. So, and understanding. And so therefore, if you can teach scientific thinking, which I think I've done it, I've seen it firsthand, it's not that difficult, on any polarizing topic. I mean, we're talking about reparations. You can talk about, for example, are the police biased, right? In terms of shootings, are they more likely to shoot a black person, suspect, than a white? There's conflicting evidence on that, though many people think, yes, they are. There's equally good evidence, no, they're not. Again, I'm not weighing in on this. I'm not saying personally what I think. It's not really relevant. What I'm saying is let's look at the mixed evidence, teaching people how to sort through mixed evidence, which in the social sciences is mostly mixed.
Right. Well,
mostly contradictory findings.
Reading your book, that came to mind, that the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, and immediately the mind goes to anecdotal thinking and then stereotyping. Okay, I've seen 3 videos in the last 2 weeks of white cops killing black guys, therefore cops are racist, right? But the science that you describe in the book, really, we can't even in principle make that kind of generalization unless it was every one of them. Because what we really want to know is not, do white cops kill black people? It's, why did that guy, Derek Chauvin, kill that guy at that moment? Why did that happen?
Correct. But also we want to know, so Roland Fryer did a great study out of Harvard showing, yes, the police, showing the police are not biased. Great study. It's been looked at a lot. And he was very surprised. He happens to be African American.
Yeah, I saw that study.
He was very surprised. Of course, then Cody Ross did another study, and he showed the exact opposite, that in fact, white cops are biased, right, in shootings. So, yes, I agree, Michael. I think you're saying 2 things. One is the outlier is very interesting, the specific case, the dynamics, but it's also interesting to look at the conflicting evidence. Why these 2 studies? And how can people make sense of this? The average citizen. I mean, the analogy I use in class, I don't know if it's a good one, but I like it. We expect people to take a driver's license test so we're safe on the road. I don't think it's much more difficult to teach scientific thinking, to analyze conflicting results so that people can see both viewpoints. And that will help them understand why. And people are polarized.
Then,
And instead of
how, in that example, how would you square those two different findings?
Well, those two findings are very interesting. They use different data
Mm-hmm.
sets. Fryer used police
Mm.
reports, which some people say are not reliable. And Ross used open data source. So they had completely different data. So the inputs were different and they used different statistical analyses. But this is the case with so many studies finding conflicting results. I mean, take the pandemic. Should we wear the mask? Some studies say yes, some studies say no. So understanding, and I wrote an article about this on Psychology Today. I don't remember if I actually got into it in the book, called Evaluating Psychology Research.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important because sometimes even personally, you need to make a decision. I broke my arm a few years ago. Should I get that thing, whatever you put in it, or not? I had to look at conflicting studies. And then I had to see, am I an outlier? Which is really important. But these are all really teachable skills. And then you have an informed group of citizens who are able to judge and evaluate. And right now, I think we've lost faith because, whether intentionally or not, and I certainly have done this. I mean, I can tell you an example of something I'm not proud of and how I was blinded by one view. But then if we're able to do that, you're more likely to see both viewpoints.
Not as equally true, but just different perspectives.
The question of equally true is a really, I think, deep question. So, because it gets at the question of, do I mean morally equivalent? And I've got a whole lot to say. I don't mean they're necessarily morally equivalent, but as I just gave you that data, if we know that 62% of Democrats think Black Lives Matter and 7 do not, well, can we look at some research to find out why? There'll always be conflicting data. So we don't come to it to decide, is Ross's study better than Fryer's? The point is to look at it and to see why are these two studies differing. Take implicit bias. That's a very important, where there's a lot of
let's talk about that.
Findings.
Yeah. What do you think of those studies? And they've been challenged now.
Well, I think you wrote a great article on it, Are We All Racist?
Yeah.
Which summarizes the major issues, but that's what I mean about applying critical thinking. I'm not trying to judge, does it exist or doesn't exist? The point is, there's a bunch of studies that say, measure's not reliable. Take it today, take it tomorrow, you're going to get different. It's like 0.3%. Other studies say it's also not predictive. You may score as a bias, right? But have nothing to do with behavior. But then there's a group of some studies that say, no, it is predictive. You did the right thing in your article. You looked at the meta-analysis, which is a way to summarize all of the studies, and then it kind of tells you something. And then you have people discuss that. So you don't have people cherry picking. Oh, you see it? Yes, this is the answer. No, this is not the answer. We're not cherry picking. We're looking at both sets of findings.
Yeah, I think a meta-analysis is super important whenever you encounter one of these cutesy psych studies, like if you keep your desktop clean, you'll donate more money, or if you're at the top of the escalator, you'll donate more money than at the bottom of the escalator. These things are just they're too kitschy in a way. Let's wait till there's 100 studies and see what comes out, something like that. Also, the convergence of evidence argument I like to use, or what William Ewell called the consilience of inductions. We have independent lines of inquiry all pointing to one particular conclusion or not. So climate change, for example, is my favorite example of this, or theory of evolution. There's not one factoid that supports these theories. There's, thousands, tens of thousands accumulated from independent lines of inquiry from different fields. So it's not like the climatologist is meeting with the geologist and the glaciologist and the guy that studies clouds, whatever that's called, or the guy that studies ecological development of flowering plants that are now flowering earlier and earlier in the year because of the temperature, and on and on and on. It's not like these guys are all meeting on the weekends to get their story straight for the liberal conspiracy against the right. It's that because they're independent, our confidence that the conclusion that global warming is real and human caused goes up. So even though there's counter studies here and there that people can point to, mostly conservatives point to these, we can, sort of counter that with this massive data from either meta-analyses or these kind of convergence of evidence from these independent lines. The other thing I want to comment about that I got from your book too was this, that we were just talking about, the cops. There is no the cops. Which cops? Which police? I mean, and which encounters? Because I read just staggering numbers recently of something like 370 million in interactions between the police and citizens every year in the United States. So that's over 1 million a day. And so, you just do a law of large numbers calculation. And if you have maybe 0.001% are just psychopathic assholes that should never have a gun and a badge, and you just multiply that by the 370 million encounters, you're going to get, some of these just real outlier incidences where somebody dies. And from a science of diversity point of view, I'm asking, is there a problem to be solved other than that particular guy should have never been given a badge? What can we do to screen those types of psychopaths out of the police department and that sort of thing?
And that's really important. It's not only the cops. I think, at least my read of news and media and everything is there's a lot of lumpers out there. So there are the whites, the blacks, and it's constant, even in popular books now. I know the whites think this, I know the blacks think this, I think, or the cops or what have you. And reality, and I'm using that word carefully, shows us that within any group, there's a lot of variety. There's not only differences between groups, there's tremendous differences in groups. Gould wrote a brilliant article on this. I can't remember the title exactly. It had median and mode in it, and it was why. And when it was applying to his
cancer,
cancer, and he was trying to, but it's a very deep article because I think it gets to exactly what you're asking about. I mean, what you're referring to, which is the importance of understanding the outlier. The outlier isn't just a freak, right? We all are truly unique. So sometimes you want to understand things on average, like if I'm in the insurance business, but other times, if you're talking to Black people or white people, it's more useful to say, who is this individual person that I'm talking to now? And that's very different than addressing the group or the police. For example,
that's right. Yeah. So to our listeners, that was Steve Gould's essay, "The Median is Not the Message." So he's given this cancer diagnosis based on the median statistics, but he wants to know what's the spread, what's the standard deviation? Could he be one of the outliers? And it turns out he was, even though cancer ended up getting him in the long run, 25 years later or something like that. Different kind of cancer in that case. But, when I watched that tape of Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd, it's almost like the Eichmann trial. I didn't see an evil racist guy with hate in his heart. He looked like a cold killer, like this is just another day at the office. I mean, it was really, in a way, more frightening because it's like, how would you recognize that? It's what Hannah Arendt meant by the banality of evil. You look at Eichmann in the bulletproof box and you think, that's the guy? I thought he'd be really monstrous looking, and he looks like a paper-pushing bureaucrat. And not that Derek Chauvin looks like a paper-pushing bureaucrat, but he didn't look like, I'm just, have evil in my heart.
Well, actually, when I did the meeting between the descendants of, so I don't know much about the Nazis from a research point of view. I actually was in contact with Ricardo Eichmann, Eichmann's son.
Oh, really?
And
oh, wow.
Yeah. And so he was actually extremely helpful in getting, helping me find descendants of Nazis. Well, and this is what I mean. This is why I looked at the transmission of the impact of an injustice. So Ricardo is the youngest son, felt, and this is back to your question of variety within a group. he became an archaeologist. I've been out of contact with him for 15 years now. So he was a professor of archaeology, and he said to me, it's no surprise I would be in archaeology. He was always digging in the past. And if I had to characterize his inheritance of this legacy, he was burdened by it. He really wanted to rectify it. He was troubled by it. He had some guilt about it. He felt responsible to reach out. And that's what I mean. So was he a victim of his father's misdeeds? From his perspective, again, I would say, are you kidding me? I've suffered more than he did as a descendant, having lost everything. But from his viewpoint, it was very hard carrying that legacy, very hard. However, there's variety within a group, and this is really important. His brother did not feel that way, right? Or one of his siblings, his brother sort of supported, justified. So, and the same thing with descendants of survivors, right? I had some people who said, I'm not coming to this group to meet the other side. I'll never talk to the other side. There's variety within the group. That's why it's very hard to lump any group and make these generalizations.
For those who are affected, like the Eichmann's son, what's his name again? Rudolph? Oh, Ricardo. What is the vehicle of transmission of the guilt from the father to the son?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say all of us, you're included, Michael, have all gotten something from our parents that were transmitted through stories. Whether the stories were told through conversation, that's such an important question, because that's a lot of my research, and I talk about that in chapter 2 and 3. That's what I called our attachments, our identities. How is that transmitted? Well, there's so much biological evidence, and I don't think this is a big surprise, that we are very attached, most of us, to our caretaker, whether that be our mother, our primary caretaker. And we identify then, right, very strongly biologically. And that becomes who we are. And that's how it's transmitted through the stories. We try to make sense of it. Where did his guilt come from? Or where did my sense of, wow, this was so unfair what was done to my parents? Well, then maybe there are the personality characteristics. I was sensitive to that. I was curious. I was inquisitive. Sounds to me like Ricardo was too. He became an academician. He was curious. He brought that kind of digging in the past kind of mind to it. But that's where the personality variables, I guess, come into it. But that's why it's unreasonable to think that rationality will by itself solve any of these polarizing topics. That's like asking someone, like an Irish and a Catholic, who've been at war for 500 years in the Troubles, oh, just forget about that. Just come to the table and let's talk rationally.
Right.
Their very identities for 500 years are wrapped up in this. And it's like asking someone to let go of who they are. It's just not possible.
Right.
Very unlikely, I should say. Very unlikely.
Same thing with same thing with Israeli-Arab conflict and the attempt at a two-state solution. Seems like a no-brainer to those of us on the outside. Just do it.
Correct. But that's why rationality can be a strong bond between people, but it's not going to work. It's apt to fail when there are these strong feelings tied in with our identities, especially if there's been a traumatic injustice in the legacies. And so then you have to have, through this scientific method, this ability to look at the polarizing side, to look at the evidence, which, and this may be surprising, there's no expert here. Each person does it themselves. And that kind of gets you to understand the inner workings of how you're understanding the conflicting data.
I think you hinted it in your book, I think, on possible epigenetic changes due to trauma, victimization, PTSD, and so on that can be transmitted across generations. I think this is still pretty controversial and fairly new research, but are you confident that this may pan out as something that's also a vehicle of transmission?
It could be. I'm not. I mean, I do write about it, and I'm not an expert on epigenetic research. But it seems to me if you just understand that as the evolution of cultural learning, it just makes sense to me, right? And maybe that's not sufficient way to understand it, that things are transmitted to us through learning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I need to understand about epigenetics. That my parents' experiences, your parents' experiences at some level were transmitted to us and has some impact on our identity that it's not necessarily transmitted through genetic information, but through cultural information. That's the real point for me about epigenetics. And why wouldn't that be? I mean, culture is so important to human evolution. We have changed so much. I mean, sometimes I'm amazed at what's happening with the pandemic and how much behaviors are changing, how we are adapting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's an instant of learning, and our cultural interactions are changing rapidly in 3 months. Some people faster than others. So that, by the way, I was thinking about this, is why I'm actually really hopeful, not optimistic. I see that as two completely different things. Because I think as long as we're alive, we can learn, humans,
Mm-hmm.
and also unlearn. So that makes me hopeful that these polarizing topics that have brought much conflict today, now, animosity, misunderstandings, that through learning we can evolve.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the pretty dramatic differences in support for Black Lives Matter between Republicans and Democrats, or liberals and conservatives. Why is that, do you think? And what can we do about that?
Right. And so that speaks exactly to many of these polarizing topics that I'm talking about. I can tell you what we cannot do about it. I think imposing a preemptive, what should be done, for example, XYZ, it is going to breed resentment. Like if we say we must have reparation programs, well, some people will disagree with that. So if you want to have a conversation, move forward, you first have to begin from the point of view that there are two sides and that you have to have a fair-minded way, because conflict between the two sides, that's reality. That's going to go on forever. So what is a fair mechanisms for handling that? The only thing that I know is being able to look at both viewpoints scientifically and considering both without imposing something. That's why I give the example with implicit bias. If you begin a mandatory diversity training saying you must get rid of your bias, you're already beginning it with a preemptive pejorative, telling someone what they must do. People who have a different view and don't want to be controlled, many people are like that, who want to feel like they have a right, are going to resent that. So even though it may be a great, good intentions, it's going to backfire.
Also, if they're not really racist and you tell them, well, but unconsciously you are, and you don't even know it. So get in there and do the training. They're going to resent it even more.
Exactly. Right. And then that's actually what we used to call in psychology a double bind, right? If you're telling people what they really are and they don't even know it, and then using that as evidence, you see, you haven't even admitted it, then they're caught. And you're not going to be able to have a meaningful conversation under those conditions. You're not going to be able to move forward. But I would say if you're using the scientific thinking, looking at the both viewpoints, looking at the conflicting evidence, it is more probable that you will have a dynamic conversation where you're respecting each other's viewpoints, not trying to prove that you're right or wrong. And by the way, that's really important. They're not, our society is so much a society of debate with the legal system, trying to win my case. This method is not about winning your case. It's not about showing you're right. It's not about showing the other person's wrong. It's about wanting to move forward in a conversation. And I apply that to myself. So I might also add, I may be wrong, completely wrong about this, and I would say, try it. if it doesn't work, then stop it. But don't take my word for it.
Yeah, I have a lot of conservative friends, and we talk about this when we're out on our bike rides, and they say I don't support the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, do you think Black Lives Matter? Of course, I think Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter too. That made me think maybe that should have been the slogan: Black Lives Matter too, because that's unobjectionable. Of course, they do. But unfortunately, like all social movements, the Black Lives Matter movement has taken on a whole bunch of other baggage along with it that people don't support, and therefore they jettison the whole thing, and then that makes it even more polarized.
Yes, because it means two things. Someone actually mentioned that in class last night, that it's both a movement and it's a statement, and that's true, and that's really important.
Yeah, because I will say yes, of course, Black Lives Matter. Then you support reparations. Well, maybe not. Oh, so you don't think Black Lives Matter? No, these are two different things. So, and again, I was thinking of the research of Seth Stevens-Davidovitz, who was a Google data analyst. He wrote a book about this, about line and detecting line or whatever. I forget the title of it, but it was using Google search algorithms to see what people look up. Now, this doesn't target in the data sets who said it, but geographically, you can see where, for example, people looked up N-word jokes right after Obama was elected, and there was a little spike in this, and it was a spike in sort of these more conservative areas. So anyway, his whole book is pretty interesting because it shows that there's still plenty of racists around looking up jokes like that or other things that are characteristic. Although he did show that, by the way, people that are likely to look up N-word jokes online are also more likely to look up Frank Sinatra, Social Security, things that are indicating that, well, these are older people in these kind of conservative areas of the country. So, clearly racism hasn't disappeared. It's still around. But he did show that, it is definitely on the decline. Fewer people are looking up those kind of jokes than maybe 10 years ago. So it doesn't go back very far. But if you look at the research from Pew and Gallup going back to the 1950s, how likely would you be to move out if a black family moved in next door? Or would you be upset if a member of your family married a person from another race? Those numbers are all moving in the right direction, almost to the point where they don't even ask anymore, like asking, is interracial marriage moral or immoral? They don't even ask that anymore. And, so I like to say conservatives today are more socially liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. We've made a lot of progress. But the problem is it's never going to go to zero, right? There's always going to be some racist assholes around. And if you have a population of 340 million people interacting a billion times a day, you're going to get, and everybody has a video camera now, you're going to have these incidences that we see pretty much every day on YouTube of, some screaming Karen, as they're called now, at a Target refusing to put her mask on or yelling at a black person. There was just one this morning of somebody at a black family at a Hilton. They were at the pool and somebody said, what are you doing here? Are you staying here? Not an employee, just some white woman. And, the black woman's like, yes, we stay here. Here's my key card. And this woman called the desk and they called the police, and it was just, of course everybody filmed it. So, it's like you're looking at this going, God, race, America is the racist nation on earth. But no, the law of large numbers, the statistics are all in the right direction. But again, there's just enough of these people. And it's made worse by what you just said about the kind of polarization, because people are telling them, you're a racist. No, I'm not. And then that kind of drives them further apart. And then they get mad. I'm not going to wear my mask, or, white lives matter. And, they start shouting these things in defiance. And that makes it look even worse.
Agreed.
So if you were in a room with the head of the...
But
go ahead.
I would say one of the things that's been that I have a lot of confidence in terms of what you mentioned before, where there's, there's a lot of research from different fields that points out that across globally, right, all of us have a cross-race, what's called cross-race effect, meaning we're much more able, for example, a white person to identify a white face, a black person a black face, a Asian an Asian face. We don't call this racism. We don't call this bias. It has some practical problems, like in a police lineup, if you're white or black trying to look at a white person in a lineup, you're likely to get the face wrong. Okay, so there's some practical issues, but we don't call the cross-race effect a bias or racism. We say people have a preference, easier to recognize their own kind. And we accept that as a biological limitation.
Right.
In the same way that I have a constraint, I can't bend my arm this way. We don't say, oh, you're not flexible. We recognize. Or the same way I can only remember 8 digits. These are constraints that we have as human beings, biological constraints. That's what I talk a lot about in the book. That's what I meant about attachment. So I'm always really cautious when I use the word racist. Of course, I'm not a fan of any kind of violence at all. And I say that from someone who suffered violence, having no family, his family died. So I don't say that lightly. I'm really not in favor of any violence. But I use the word racist carefully because we do have these biological constraints and preferences. And I don't see that as a racist thing. So,
yeah. So what do we call it? I mean, maybe xenophobia is too strong. Just tribal instincts to divide people between self and other, our group, in group, out group, something like that.
And probably a preference because it's familiar, and that's not a racist thing. That's a constraint. And I think we need to accept that without a judgment about it. And again, I say that with some confidence. There's been at least 600 studies with this cross-race effect, and they're not conflicting.
Right.
The only exceptions have been with adoption studies. If you're white or black, adopted by the opposite, then you don't have it as strong. Can you learn to distinguish other races? Yeah, not easily. So are these preferences bad? Should we be aiming to eliminate them? I don't know.
Well,
I don't have the answer.
One way to address that is if there's policy implications. So, like, for example, if you think, Mexicans or somebody from an Arab country is going to immigrate to America, they're not going to carry the same values we carry, therefore, and also maybe they're rapists and disease contagion carriers and so forth. You know the tropes. Therefore, we should keep them out, or we should restrict immigration. So those kinds of categorizations, which may start off as just cognitive limitations or cognitive boundaries that we have about judging other people, in the modern world of nation states with borders, and on those borders are walls, and on those walls are men with guns, then it does matter. And I guess, of
course, I mean, but I was talking more in the viewpoint, if you're in a conversation and you want to create a sense of people feeling safe in a conversation, to talk about their preferences without feeling judged, they're going to be racist. And they say, I have difficulty actually literally distinguishing people from another race. So do they have the space in a conversation to say that? I agree with you with policy, but again, my expertise is not policy. I didn't mean to imply.
But I like to talk about it because it matters, and it's a hot button issue. And you end your book talking about the nation state and what that means, and the 5 different theories about that, and then the concept of nationalism. Well, that's another one of these hot button issues today. The sense that America as a nation, or England as a nation, or Germany or France or whatever, as if it's a set of characteristics by which you can define the people. And you show how difficult that is because there's so much variation within each nation. And yet we still seem to hold it as a cognitive category fairly strongly.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, let's go through those. I really enjoyed that part of there's 5 different theories about what a nation is. Primordialism theory claims that nations and nationalism are natural phenomena. So I guess that would be any large grouping of people that are, feeling in group compared to some out group Perennialist theory purports that nations, whether natural or not, have existed as long as humans have lived in society. So that could be, like, what, maybe 1,000 people or 10,000 people. It doesn't have to be a nation of millions, I guess. And then modernist theory claims that nations and nationalism are, basically the product of 17th, 18th century, collectivization of these small city-states into larger groupings until we ended up with, what was it, something like, I think there was like 500 different European groups in 1500. Now there's, worldwide, there's 192 countries. So there's been this kind of coalescence of smaller groups into larger groups. I guess that would be the modernist theory. And then you have ethno-symbolism theory. Nation formation must be understood by considering the importance of heritage, myths, memories, values, symbols. So that's a little harder to define, I guess, in terms of how you quantify that. Postmodernist theory about nations argues that nations and nationalism are narrative and conversational constructions, ways of thinking about, talking about, and acting in the world. So I guess which one of those you think you're defining a nation as, even though most people haven't even thought about it in those terms, kind of sets the stage for what kind of nationalism you embrace, if you embrace nationalism at all.
Yeah. And there's a difference. So I think we can see that actually with Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
That difference in how they embrace nationalism.
Yeah. Again, conservatives, are big flag wavers, family, flag, faith, the 3 Fs. And you look at those personality big five studies that, conservatives tend to be, more conscientious, more closed-minded, lower on open-mindedness to experience. They tend to be a little more neurotic in the sense of being more anxious about new environments, loud noises, strange people, things like this. And so one theory is that, and we know that at least 50% of the variation in the big five personality dimensions is heritable. Therefore, there's this idea that, I'll just kind of riff for just a second here, that, as we were evolving in these small bands of hunter-gatherers, there's a sense that outsiders are dangerous. So you have to have some kind of protections against outsiders coming in to contaminate us or kill us or whatever. That's normal. And that there's going to be variations within the group. Some are more open to outsiders coming in, and that kind of diversity is good. Genetic diversity, diversity of new ideas coming into a group, but not so much that the group loses its identity. So it seems like there's always this balance between, John Stuart Mill said this, and also I think it was Bertrand Russell, that, in the sort of the history of politics, you have this, there's always kind of a duopoly. No matter what you call the different parties, they all kind of separate into these kind of left and right. And you need both, because if it's just up to one, they're going to go too far in one direction. So that kind of constant pushback. And the tension seems to be on this question, to what extent should we be open to bringing in outsiders to our group? We need some diversity is good, but not too much diversity. And that conservatives tend to be on the side of let's dial it down and not have too much diversity, and liberals the other direction, and you strike some balance there. Say the immigration policies of Japan versus the United States versus some European countries that are more liberal on that. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because you talk about this a lot in the book, about the neuroscience and psychology behind how we feel about outsiders and other people and groupings like that.
Well, I think the statement I would make is, whether you are for or against immigration, for example, or diversity, the fact is, and this is a universal truth, I don't think any listener can disagree with this, whether we like it or not, diversity is a feature of life. Whether we're talking, look out the window, plants, flowers, and human beings. So it's not whether we embrace it or impose it on others. It exists in reality. It's a fact. in the book, I talk about the origins of how we're constantly trying to make sense of the diversity. And that's been part of our historical and scientific efforts. So it's here. And there'll always be conflicting views, which is what you're just describing, on how to manage it. But I think you hit it on the head. I would say that the conflict between the views is not necessarily a bad thing. There'll always be conflicting views. My work has been, how do you manage or deal or cope with the conflicting views? That's what I've tried to put forth, really. And that's very important. I'm not arguing for or against it. I'm accepting reality as it is and saying, what are we going to do now that it's here? How can we understand it?
Okay, let's use a real world example. Let's say you're the guide for a 3-day, all-day conversation between some Israeli leaders and some Palestinian leaders. All right, how can we get to a 2-state solution? Go.
Right. So again, you're bringing it to the policy level. I'm not sure I have the expertise to be that person, but if I was bringing together Palestinians and Israelis in an informal conversation, and then maybe they would apply it to, the conflict in Israel, I would begin what we've talking about the whole time, which is each hearing the other side. There's 3 aspects to teaching scientific thinking in these conversations. And the facilitator or me, whoever, is not the expert. So it's a great word you use, more of a guide. And so what the people in these polarizing topics would be doing is first learning about themselves, the inner workings of their own mind. How are they evaluating whatever the issues are? The land, their country, nationalism, the other. Each person does that differently. How are they doing it in their own individual minds? I don't know. That's for them to discover. And the second level of learning in this conversation is, how whatever view they might be having, how is that impacting the other side? Because what we say and do in conversation has an impact on the other side, right? So if I say to you, you're a racist, you're biased, you have implicit bias, I'm probably shutting down the conversation. And it's not going to help us move forward. So they're looking at the inner workings, they're looking at what impact that has, and then they're learning to look at conflicting evidence and make sense of it. And then they're coming to the conclusion of what needs to be done. But there is no expert telling them what they should do.
Right. When I was writing The Moral Arc, it looked like nationalism was kind of on the way out. And I projected in the final chapter that maybe in a century or two, there'll be no more nation states and we'll be back to city states, just, the largely porous borders between cities, and people can go anywhere they want, and the internet and travel and on and on. Well, things have changed rather dramatically in the last 4 years. And there's, many books now defending nationalism, and,
And the Europe,
yes, and
right, the European Union is right. Yeah, no, that's true. And I think through history we've seen that. That's sort of the rise and the fall. I've looked at it also in the book a lot about what the impact is, how our relationships how human being relationships have changed over time. With the development of the nation state, which is also really interesting to me. Literally, because that has an impact on how we interact with each other, how these conversations take place.
Which of those theories of the nation do you embrace, or do you think has the most explanatory power for what people do and think?
I don't know. I'd have to review it again. I don't.
I was just thinking about that.
I really have to read it because I haven't thought about that chapter, and I didn't know we discussed it. So it's funny. I'd have to go back and look at it. I think I was presenting it as alternatives, is what, and I was trying to look at the factors because of the increase in nationalism. But that is why I actually think scientific thinking is so important, which was my point. There definitely has been a trajectory up of nationalism. And so I'm not the first to say this. Einstein, Feynman, Madame Curie, I begin my whole book on that. When they were talking about the importance of scientific thinking, they were doing it at a time that they were concerned about the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, and they were saying that the only way to kind of counter the effects of the rise of nationalism and fascism was to have people develop autonomous thinking. That was really my point.
Yeah, I like that point. That's a great point.
Are we in a similar situation now to that? And how can that be countered? And I would agree with that statement, Michael. I think very strongly, I completely agree with them, that it's not the content of the science, it's the way to think so that you can think for yourself autonomously, which has become more and more important, especially now. I mean, they didn't even have to, well, Feynman talked a lot about propaganda. Those were the words now. Now we talk about it as post-truth. And I know people say, oh, no, there's no such thing as not post-truth because if I'm talking about it, but I'm not being philosophically clever here. There is, it is more difficult for the public to grab onto a agreed upon truth. And Feynman and Einstein saw that happen, different time periods, but for similar reasons. And so that, to me, is what's important with the rise of nationalism. We know that income inequality is very correlated. And the studies looks, I may be wrong, and someone could find some contradictory studies, but it seems to be related to the rise in nationalism as well.
Yeah.
The higher the state of income inequality, the more likely the higher, nationalism. So I think what I'm proposing is really important. I mean that sincerely, because I think it really does offer the chance for people to think through these issues in a more thoughtful way. And the fact that Einstein and Madame Curie and Feynman said it before me makes me more confident because they're wiser
Scientists,
than I am.
not politicos or philosophers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tell us again in your own words, what are you proposing?
Well, on a very concrete level, I'm proposing that learning to think scientifically be sandwiched in all classes. That, I think it was Plato, right? If you had to go to the academy, you weren't allowed in if you didn't know geometry. I would say you should not be allowed out of the gates, especially a place like Harvard, unless you've learned how to think scientifically. It seems to me it's a very important skill for citizens to have. And that just giving people information and facts is not sufficient. It's not a top down. It's giving them the critical skill, what we were talking about, to weigh conflicting evidence and then understand the inner workings of their own mind. Why are they cherry picking? Why do they want this study to be the right one? We all do that. I mean, I'll give you a funny example of it, but it was actually a profound experience I had just a few days ago. I've been very focused. And again, I'm not proud of this, but it just shows you how you can zero in on something, right? And not see the whole picture. And I was very focused on how many people should we have in a discussion group? What's the best for the discussion to occur, especially on Zoom? I've been doing this for many years, 3, 4, 5. And for years, I've been asking this question, looking at the research. And I finally asked the dean of the summer school at Harvard, what do you think? Because I was in a faculty meeting, there were 5 of us. And I thought, so I've had it wrong. It shouldn't be said to me. Well, actually, I don't think it has anything to do with the number of people. It's the people, the participants. And I was like, well, that's obvious. I literally had this zero view on it, and I was very attached. And that's just an example with no emotion attached to it. But so teaching students how to think scientifically enlarges the vision, conflicting evidence. They're less likely to become polarized. That's what I'm suggesting.
I think that's brilliant. Absolutely. Of course, I love that. That's what I think too. So I know you're right.
Well, then we don't have to say anything else.
The biggest obstacles to that now are, the sort of polarized media and social media, in which there's very little subtlety and like acknowledgement.
That's such an important word. Thank you, Michael. I've been fixated on this word, subtlety and nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you mentioned before. Correct. I'm sorry to
No, that's
interrupt
right.
you, but I got excited. Nuance. And that's what critical thinking does. It teaches nuanced thinking. So not all whites, all blacks, all conservatives. There's a nuanced discussion to understanding the data. And I think that is very important.
Well, we need an economic model for media companies to embrace that, because it seems like the simpler and more polarized and black and white it is, the more hits they get, or commercials that they sell, or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no. I wish I knew how to.
But back to, at the end of your book, you make this distinction between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. So it's the ethnic nationalism that has me worried, because it's kind of a throwback to the old blood and soil, defining people by almost their genes, or what piece of geography they happen to be sitting on. Whereas civic nationalism is more of a collection of ideas. It's the ideas that we should care about. I mean, certain like civil rights, civil liberties, gay rights, gay marriage, women's rights, and so forth, animal rights and whatnot. Those aren't, to me, those aren't Western values, even though you can track it historically through Western traditions of thinking. They're human values, sort of that the idea of universal human rights. In fact, that when that was adopted in 1948, it still holds pretty well. And I sometimes politically correct people are accusing, Westerners of genocide and whatnot, and then affiliating that set of ideas. No, that you have to separate those. The sort of ethnic nationalism, people doing things in the name of their country that are bad for other people in other nations. That's different from, we want to spread the idea of, say, democracy or civil rights in other countries. We want to hold China accountable for their civil rights violations, however we do that, through economic sanctions or something. That's a different kind of nationalism than that ethnic nationalism. So I like that you make that distinction at the end of your book.
I make the distinction, but I would say again, there'll always be people who espouse ethnic nationalism, the rule of the law, or blood and soil, as you put it, and are less likely to want immigration and so forth. And I'm saying there'll always be alternative views of what the correct nationalism is. I wouldn't say that ethnic nationalism is better. I might personally believe that, but I have to be open to the view, as long, and this is important, we did not get to this, but I think I do want to say this because I think it's very important. I'm open to the view of blood and soil view of nationalism, with the one statement, and that I don't mean to suggest that all views, pluralism, moral equivalency. I'm not suggesting that all views have equal value. I am saying if there's any view, and whether that be the blood and soil view or whatever view that says we need to destroy the diversity, that's where the buck stops, so to speak. So I would say I'm a proponent of pluralism, hypothetical views of nationalism, as long as no one is calling for the destruction of any of it. I don't know if that's clear, but that's important. So I'm not espousing civic nationalism. I mean, I may personally, again, agree with that, but there'll always be people who disagree with me, and I want to talk to those people. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I haven't thought it through. Maybe I don't know what it's like to have come, for example, to the United States on the Mayflower, right, and have 10 generations and see my country change so much. Maybe I would not like the changes at a feeling level. I would like to be entitled to those feelings. That's not my case. I come from a family of immigrants, and so I'm obviously very happy that the country allowed it, my parents.
But you're also Jewish, so do you feel like that the existence of Israel as a nation state is really important, because we have this kind of deep sense of a place to call our own, each group or something like that. And because of the diaspora for thousands of years, this was fully justified on that level, something like that.
Well, yeah, Michael, those are big
Yeah.
topics. So first of all, when you say you're Jewish or Israel or Zionism, um, just personally, I that to me is like lumping in a
Hmm.
category. That's like saying you're white. So what do you think
Okay.
about this?
Right.
Um, I'm not offended at all. It's just that I probably don't fit the
Okay.
category.
Right. Diversity.
That would be a whole conversation. Not that I'm against the category, but I probably am an
Okay.
outlier in my
Interesting.
views on that. And also, I might say that my views on that have evolved a
Oh,
lot.
interesting.
I've changed I've changed my mind a
You
lot,
did?
which is I yeah, I actually said to someone before the interview, "Oh my goodness, how about if he reads something I wrote in high school and he asks me that?" Which you didn't find, so that's good. How do I explain it? And I asked my teaching fellow, and he said, just, you're an example of what you're talking about. My thinking has evolved.
Well, that's good.
So
That
I don't know what the question is exactly on that, but
Well, I was
um,
just in my own head thinking out loud about the nation state. I'm not a big fan. To me, in the long run, I'd like to see borders dissolve. I love the idea of the EU, and that you can just travel from one country to another without passports and all that. And why can't the whole world be like that? And I'm always citing one of my favorite movies, A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson schools Tom Cruise on the nature of the real world. That we live in a world with walls, and on those walls are men with guns, and you want me on that wall. He's kind of defending that kind of conservative defense of the military and why you need a strong military, because that's the world we live in. Okay, well, he's right. That is the world we live in. But wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to have walls with men with guns on them? And so I like the idea of dissolving nations' borders and have a more diverse, world community. But I think we're a long ways from that, if ever, centuries maybe. I don't know, but anyway, that's why I was thinking out loud. Although I've always been a supporter of Israel. I'm not Jewish, but and the fact that I even have to say that is idiotic. But the Jewish people I know, it's like I totally get this. Why everybody wants this is my country. Everybody feels that way, and that seems
the Palestinians feel that way
yeah, that's
too,
right. Yeah,
right?
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So, I mean, I think it's very important. And it's funny, back to what I'm saying about polarized views. I haven't looked at the book, but I heard there's a history book that's taught to Israelis and
mm,
Palestinians that discuss the creation of Israel. And in one line, they have the Israeli version, and in the other, they have the
right.
Palestinian. So what's called the independence is called I forget, in the Palestinian view, the tragedy or
Mm,
something. So I would say, in discussing this topic, which is a very polarizing topic, back to what I've been saying, we need to see both those
yeah,
views. There's not a one view. And there are two groups of
yeah,
people with variety of opinions in both. But um, it's interesting that they actually have a history book like that, first of its kind, because it was always taught
interesting. Yeah,
in one view
yeah,
only. And so obviously, if you teach it in only one view, your view on nationalism is going to be different. That's what I meant by the evolution of my view. I probably started very one
yeah,
sided because no one presented the other view to me. And so now I can look at both views much better.
yeah.
And I think a lot of these conflicts, back to the Protestants and the Catholics, these are historical conflicts that go back hundreds of years. In the case of Palestinians and Israelis, I actually think it's one of the first injustices in the
Mm,
Bible that's ever been discussed, which was, when the son the Arab son was excluded from his
mm.
inheritance. And there's some collective, I wouldn't be surprised, trauma that's been passed down about that injustice. But injustice is usually a two-sided issue.
I,
And questions of nationalism are like that
I
too.
think we would need in America, at the very least, a three-panel history, because the Native Americans also, and
Right.
back to
Right.
reparations. The moment you open that door up, well, the Native Americans have at least as strong a case as African Americans, and so
And white Americans have a case too. Again, I'm not saying I agree with it, but there's complexity. What was the word you used? Not nuanced. You
Oh,
used a
subtlety.
synonym. There's a subtlety, and these topics are usually not discussed with that subtlety. Um, Gates's work is really good about the slavery trade, and I recommend that people look at how he understands it, because he gets into the complexity, and he says we can't teach it. We can't teach it because people are not ready for the complexity. When I did the Descendant of the Slave and Slave Owner meetings, I had the same, Survivor Nights had the same issue. I brought the complexity. I brought descendants of collaborators. It's not a black and white situation. There is a gray zone. Descendant wise, again, I really want to emphasize, I'm not talking about people who committed crimes. So that complexity has to be brought, and definitely with the Palestinian and the Israeli. Yeah. And that's where I'm back to my point. That's why scientific thinking is so important, because it trains the mind to consider those variables that are missing. Unlike me, focused on what's the number of people I need? No, there are other variables we have to consider. Not to mention, even when we have all the variables, there's conflicting evidence. And that helps the discussion a lot, because then you can talk about these things, really getting the fuller picture, which...
A couple other things I wanted to ask you about. You talk about you have a chapter on intergenerational justice that we've touched on. In the Ten Commandments, God portends to punish, quote, the iniquity of the fathers on children to the third and fourth generation. Of course, to which we go, what? And then you say the Bible also says that it's wrong to punish anyone for the sins of another. So how are those squared?
Right. It's very interesting. I like to look to the Bible as a way of how we've understood our history. And I think that's the contradiction. So I think at a human psychological level, I want to hold all Germans responsible for the fact that I grew up without a family. I mean, that was my feeling growing up. It was not easy not having zero relatives. Someone's got to be responsible for this. So that's a normal thing. I don't care whether you were alive or not, okay? You should feel guilty. You should feel responsible. And furthermore, you should feel like you want to make it up to me. That's a normal feeling. Most of us, and I through a lot of the evidence, have a psychological need to right a wrong. Psychologically, again, I don't mean legally. And if that can't be done, we're frustrated. But the reality is, and I think that the Bible gets at that. Is it really right that I'm holding someone responsible who wasn't alive? Am I, in fact, making that person feel guilty and causing some harm that I'm not even aware of? I mean, I have a very, very close dear friend who's a child of a Waffen-SS officer. We've been friends for 30 years. She grew up with such guilt and shame. It took her a long time. I personally would not want to be contributing to that. It doesn't seem right to me. She was not born when this happened. And that's taken a long development. And we can obviously see that model with descendants of slave and slave woman. Of course, many descendants of slaves are going to feel, are you kidding me? I don't care that it's 9 generations ago. Whites are still benefiting from it. But there are many whites who don't have that view, like my friend. They feel that they're being held accountable for something they had no take in. In fact, they feel they're victims. And because they have not had the benefits, and they're resentful of things like affirmative action.
Yes,
and other
well,
things,
they helped elect Donald Trump in 2016, that kind of vast Midwest poor whites that never recovered from the 08, 09 meltdown. And, the opioid crisis hit them hardest, and they feel like they're victims.
Correct. And so I would say that if we want to move forward, those are viewpoints that deserve our listening to, because...
Yeah, you had a couple other points I found interesting in discussion of what I think is called just world theory. I'm quoting you here, just observing an innocent person being victimized is sufficient to make the victim seem unworthy. And then you're citing Lerner here. I'm not sure who that is. Observed that when one of 2 men was chosen at random to receive a reward for a task, this caused him to be more favorably evaluated by observers, even though the observers had been informed that the recipient of the reward was chosen at random. This is, I think conservatives more than liberals embrace this just world theory. If somebody's poor, it's because they're lazy or they don't work hard or, whatever. In a way, it's kind of you mentioned cognitive dissonance. It's cognitively dissonant to see that there's people less well off than me, poorer than me, and so on. And the just world theory is a way of reducing the dissonance by saying, well, that's the way it is. That's the way it's supposed to be. I worked hard.
Correct.
And
blame the victim. Right. But I want to say that.
Go ahead.
Right. You blame the victim. So they haven't succeeded. You see that with rape victims. So she was raped because she was probably provocative or did something. But back to the conservative view, I would look at the evidence. I personally have heard, for example, people say, wow, I've got higher unemployment in these last few months than my job because there's this additional $600 they've been getting, and I'm not sure I want to go back to my job. So, I mean, this is an N of one or two, but I would not dismiss the conservative view that people have gotten, more than I was given or something. I'm saying that view needs to be considered as well, even though I may not agree with it. And that's what's important in these discussions. I don't know if I explained that. That
makes sense. I remember there were stories out of the Holocaust again that when I was researching my book on that that a lot of Germans would. The Germans deprived Jewish communities of a lot of the basics of life, and then looked at them and said, "Look, they live like animals. Look how dirty they are." Well, you took away their homes. It's a way of rationalizing or justifying in their own minds, the Germans, I guess, for why it was okay that they did this.
Yeah, and again, even in that, and I think I go over this in my other book, Justice Matters. Obviously, I don't agree, as I said in the beginning, to the destruction of diversity, whether it's Jews, blacks, whoever. But if you look at Hitler's Mein Kampf, it's very logical. His explanation that Jews are taking over the world and Germans are suffering because of what the Jews have done. I'm saying there's an argument there. I mean, that's actually what's kind of scary about it. But you can look at these arguments and try to understand them, as long as they're not, trying to destroy the other side in that case. But the other, what you were describing about, saying, creating a situation and then saying, oh yeah, you see they're acting that way. I mean, those are tricks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so like one conservative argument against Black Lives Matter is, well, most of the crime against blacks is by other blacks, or most homicides in the black community are by black on black crime, say. Well, but then why is that even, assuming that's true, why is that? We have to look at the deeper issues of, poverty and fatherless homes, or, whatever, half a dozen different variables. That was the other thing at the beginning of your book that I thought was pretty interesting about, sort of the tracking the history of psychology from Freud to behaviorism to the cognitive revolution. And that's where I came online in psychology, was in that transition from behaviorism to cognitive psych. I actually worked for 2 years in a Skinnerian lab running experiments with rats in boxes, pressing bars. So I kind of missed the cognitive revolution, what had happened in the late 70s and 80s, which is super interesting. But now you talk about embodied cognition, ecological psychology, acts of meaning, and action, ENACTION, situated cognition, embedded cognition, extended cognition. These are examples of the terms that post-cognitive researchers introduced. So just give us a little 5-minute, kind of overview of what psychology has gone through in, well, I say the last 20 years. In 5 minutes or less, please.
That's not fair. I haven't read that chapter in a while. But I'll say one thing about that, what the important point. I'll summarize it. The important point, I think, is where we started and where we've ended up in psychology. And so where we started was seeing the human being as a black box, pretty much. or there were some things that we don't really understand, and then we progressed a little to the input and the output. But the arrow, what happens between the input and the output? That's the way I think about it. The Skinnerian model was do this and you get this, and then comes along, oh, so something happens here, right? Motivation. And then there was the computer model. Oh, humans are just like machines, right? And we had all these great cognitive psychologists talk about the metaphor of the mind as a brain. But then there were biologists, Varela and other very interesting biologists, who said, you know what, human beings are autonomous and you cannot separate. And this is the really important point to all that I've been talking about. This is why I've said in the interview several times, you cannot expect people to solve these problems. Sometimes I hear colleagues say, oh, we just tell them about their cognitive biases. We just tell them to be rational. Right. No, because human beings are embodied and our cognitions are related to our emotions. Without our emotions, we couldn't make decisions. The rational would not allow us, in some circumstances, yes, but not in all. That's the real point of that. That's what I was really trying to get at. And so if you're trying to deal with these polarizing topics where there's a traumatic event, history and memories and identities, and I try to explain that whole process in the book, our evaluations of everything in life are very much connected to our feelings about it.
You have this passage. And so this passage I highlighted. Dreyfus and other post-cognitive researchers argue that a science of the mind will never be able to understand the human mind and behavior in the same way scientists understand objects in, for example, physics or chemistry. That is, by considering people as things whose mind and behavior can be predicted via objective, context-free scientific laws. This is what I mean at the beginning of our conversation, that you're kind of undermining this long scientific tradition of, we're going to find the laws of human action and boom, we got it.
Yes, and I've thought a lot about this in 20 years, and I think that's because it's, first of all, people studying people, right? It's not people studying objects. And so once people studying people, Robert Rosenthal, one of my mentors at Harvard, brilliant, talked about all the artifacts, what happens, right? I don't know what you're going to do when I say something. I mean, I might be able to predict it, but in this conversation, you may ask me something I've never been asked before. I may say something you've never heard before. There's an unpredictable element to human interaction. And when a scientist is a person, researcher studying another, unpredictable things happen. And so we can't have an input-output model. We have to have an indeterministic model. And we have to understand how people evaluate. I call it developing a potential. So rather than, sometimes, of course, we can predict. If I hit you over the head with a hammer, I know you're going to scream. But if I'm having a dynamic conversation, what I think scientific thinking helps in these indeterministic situations is to create a potential so that we can move forward and learn together. Right. It's a dynamic system. And that to me has been really helpful, personally and professionally. Again, I may be completely wrong.
Well, it's the best. It's the best argument that I make for cryonics is so you can be frozen and come back 500 years to see how that particular argument turned out.
Yeah.
Oh, consciousness. We figured that out 2 centuries ago. That's a no-brainer. Oh, really? Speaking of which, I also highlighted this passage in your discussion of AI. Post-cognitive researchers argue that human mental life depends mainly on unconscious, subjective judgments rather than conscious, objective information manipulation, and that these unconscious phenomena can never be captured in formal computational rules as suggested by the traditional cognitive approach. Post-cognitive researchers assert that to get a computer to have a human-like mind requires computers to have a human-like being in the world, with little hyphens in there, human-like being in the world, and to have bodies more or less like humans and social acculturation, in other words, society, more or less like humans. So many AI researchers, and also I encountered this with this is from my previous book on Heavens on Earth about the attempts to achieve immortality. These people have the idea of mind uploading. We're going to upload your mind, get your connectome, copy every single synaptic connection in your brain, upload it to the cloud, and you'll go there. Well, first of all, you wouldn't go anywhere because it's just a copy. So you're still here wherever the copy machine is. But nevertheless, that wouldn't capture anything you just described, right? That you have to. It's not just a mind; it's a mind in a body, and not just a mind in a body. It's a body in a physical environment that moves around, and most of the processing of all that information happens subconsciously. There's no algorithms you can mimic in a computer that would capture that. And then multiply that by a gazillion, for all the interactions with people we have, with environments, plants, animals, and so on, everything.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So there are situations, obviously, that our systems are deterministic, but there is this whole other realm of what I call indeterminism, where you can't predict.
So do you think this is...
And that is the human being, and that is interactions. And I'm trying to think of an analogy to chess, but it's not good, so I'm not going to use it.
Yeah, or maybe Go. It seems to be the new model.
Yeah.
Well, this could explain both why, human level AI, is 5 years away and always will be, as they say. It's a much harder problem than we thought. And it's not just a harder problem, algorithmically, like computers that finally beat Garry Kasparov in chess. They just got the number crunching capability finally there. We're never going to get there with this particular approach, I think, is the implications of this post-cognitive research, that this is the wrong approach to take.
Because humans evaluate relations, and they put values and judge relations, and it's hard to predict that. So if you just have material, AI could be good just with deterministic systems, but let's go to our polarized topics. Let's take any polarizing topic. Immigration. And let's take that. Some people for it, some people against it. That we could call a relational parameter, what I call a relational. And I wrote about this in Doing Psychotherapy Effectively. That means some people value newness, openness positively. Emotionally, it's a judgment about that relation. Other people don't. They have a negative feeling about it, right? And so because we value relationships differently, I don't think that can be programmed. I think that, and we can switch those. That's why it's helpful to understand. Take a marital example. If you're in a couple and my husband likes new adventures and I don't, we have different values on this. Well, maybe over time we'll switch and understand and change each other's evaluations. But these are values we give. And I think that's why you can't use the input-output. Mm-hmm. That's why you can't just be a deterministic system. I don't know if that explained it, but that's how I understand it.
I think also helps explain the difficulty in explaining consciousness. Not the neural correlates of consciousness, but the actual experience of it. I think everything you've just described complicates it, orders of magnitude more than it already was.
Yeah. And it's what makes each of us kind of different from the other, which is why it's, we can share, but you can't love, but I don't want to underestimate. We can predict a lot of our preferences. That's why the advertising is so successful, right? I know if you check out one liberal view, I can predict, I understand it. That's how a lot of advertising works. I can predict probably what you're going to buy. And if I know what you just bought on Amazon, if you bought a tie versus hiking shorts, I can say a lot about you. So we are very predictable and deterministic in many areas, but we can't ignore that there are these indeterministic, unpredictable aspects of human behavior and life, the pandemic, these social changes. No one could predict this. We still don't know how to deal with it because there's a lot of uncertainty. Yeah. We don't have models from the past. That, my very point, is the universe as a whole indeterministic?
Well, so now you get to free will. Where does free will enter into all this? Or volition, or whatever words you want to use.
I don't know. I think you know more about
I don't know the answer either. I'm a compatibilist. I think I think for the very things, everything you've been saying, that we are engaged in the causal net of the universe ourselves and can manipulate it either consciously or unconsciously. And maybe that's also a causal vector and therefore we're all determined, but at least we can be aware of the determining factors and tweak them a little bit. Therefore, we can hold people accountable and so forth. So, but, again, it's a hard problem because of the way the words are defined. We may be restricted on our cognition about it because of language. I don't know. See if there's anything else I wanted to ask you here before we wrap up. Mona, we've been going almost 2 hours. Oh my God, I just looked at the clock. Wow, there's so much interesting stuff here. I think your book, Science of Diversity, this should be read by everybody thinking about these particular issues. Diversity, you have chapters on diversity in groups, diversity in social justice. That made me think about this other thing we're undergoing now, this whole what it means to be a gender. Have a sex role or a gender role, and now there's all this stuff about gender dysphoria, and I was born a woman but I feel like a man, so should I get the surgery? You're aware that this has become a controversial subject that touches on the nature of self, I guess, which you also hint at in the book. This self is rather a elusive concept. I feel like a self and I define myself by certain characteristics, but I can't do that outside of how I'm situated in my nation state, in my gender, my group, my race, my everything.
That's really, I have two things to say. The practical, it's interesting. We talk about gender, and this is an example of good intentions and good solutions can have paradoxical effects. So there was a rule at Harvard, I don't know the exact details, but the single gender clubs were being penalized. They were trying to discourage all male or all female. And then just the other day, the judge in Boston said that denied Harvard's case to continue. And so President Baco put out a very interesting memo saying, well, obviously we're going to abide by what the judge said. And the logic here was that in trying to solve a discrimination, we were actually perpetuating a discrimination. And so there is a good example. You brought up gender. You have a good solution. We're going to ban the one gender clubs. But in doing that, you're actually creating resentment. Right. So, but to your question of the self, I've thought a lot about that. And I think that's a very interesting question. And I've come to the conclusion, just for me personally, that things don't always appear the way they are in reality. And that's helpful to know, first of all. So, I think all of us can understand that the world does look flat. This is obvious, right? But it's deceiving. And that's a good example. We're not aware of gravity, but obviously it's what's keeping us stable. We're not aware of moving so fast, but so appearances are not reality. And I think for me, it's been helpful to think of the self like that, because it looks like I'm independent.
Feels like it.
And autonomous. Feels like it. I know where my body begins and ends. But again, pragmatically, look at the pandemic. You see how intertwined our lives are. Could not function without, Whole Foods has a sign, you're more than essential. Really, we're interconnected insofar I'd have no food if there weren't people willing to go to the supermarket. And so our connection with each other, though it may not be visible, though we may have the means to think we're independent, we're obviously have some, obviously to me, we have some interconnection with each other. And I know this may sound naive, but, and that is why I like your vision of, oh, no borders. It kind of goes with my vision of, that's why it makes sense to help each other and understand the other, because we are at some level interconnected. And if I may add one thing here, because I mean this deeply, and I've written this, but I've thought a lot about it. my mother was 17 when she was in Auschwitz. She lost everyone. So she suffered a lot, saw a lot of suffering. And before she died, she did that interview with Spielberg, and for someone talking about, and they asked her, what's the last message? This is maybe a few months before she literally died. What's your last message you want to give people, your experience in Auschwitz? And so she said, I don't want anyone to suffer like I did. And I thought, wow, that's profound. I was really surprised that she had it in her heart to care about other people. And that to me speaks to, she wasn't just a self. She probably had some sense of that, you know? And so that's what I have to say about the self.
Yeah, that's quite a powerful story about your mom. Wow, that's incredible.
Well, I figure if she could do that and care about the other, after all she's been through, well, why wouldn't I? And do the little that I could do. And that's why I think it's worth hearing the other side, even when we don't agree with them, whether they be liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, Black Lives Matter, not mine.
Yeah. Well, Mona, I want to ask you just one last thing. You know, we're recording this right smack in the middle of 2020, which could end up being the biggest year since 1968 or the end of the Vietnam War, something, or maybe even worse than that, or more dramatic than that. We have COVID-19, the shutdown of the economy, so economic stresses, unemployment, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, you know, and whatever else gets thrown in the next 6 months. How do you think life may change in the coming decade or two because of all these changes?
Wow. You know, it's interesting you've asked that because, as I said, usually when we make prediction in science, we have something in the past to go on so we can predict it. So what I did as a scientist was obviously look at the pandemic. I mean, the flu, because that's the closest of 1918. Okay, so what happened when they got out of it? As so that I could see something. Interestingly, right, they went into a period of exuberance, the roaring 1920s. Fitzgerald, the party. Exuberant.
Yeah.
The only way I know how to make a prediction is based on the past, but I don't think this pandemic is necessarily similar.
I know. The answer may be, I don't know, and you don't either. Nobody does.
I cannot say. I mean, on the positive side, as I mentioned before, I've been amazed at how human behavior has adapted.
Yeah, pretty adaptive, yes.
Socially, pretty adaptive. So is it good? Is it bad?
What about the future of higher education? I assume Harvard will be okay, but there's a lot of...
Oh, that is, that's huge. I mean, I think that is a huge question and that I've thought a lot about. And, well, I mean, I have a lot to say about that. I don't want to take up more of your time, but a lot of that has to do with our delivery of education. I've been actually teaching my course at Harvard on Zoom before the pandemic. So I did it 8-9 years ago. When we started teaching online, there was no video. I taught this course only with audio because Zoom didn't have
video
the capability. And I had a hard time explaining to people why you could create human interaction on Zoom. So in terms of where education is going, it seems to me now that's less of an argument. People do see value, but I don't think it substitutes for, you know, let's go have coffee together.
Well, Mona, there's your next book, How to Survive in the Remote Educational Environment.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Michael. I'm a real fan of your podcast.
Thank you. And I appreciate that.
I appreciate it. And I think skeptic, the whole approach is very aligned with my view and very important, necessary, and helpful. So thank you for
saying that. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming on the show. And thanks for writing your books and keep it up.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.